The morning Marlene Dennison slid that laminated notice under every door on Crestwood Circle, I was already awake, standing at my kitchen window with a mug of coffee watching the snow come down in sheets so thick I could barely see my own mailbox. It was January, mid-January to be specific, the kind of mid-January that makes you question every life decision that led you to buying a house in the upper Midwest. The forecast the night before had called for 8 to 12 inches overnight with another 2 to 4 through mid-morning. By the time my alarm went off at 6, it was already clear that the forecast had been conservative. There was easily a foot and a half sitting on my driveway. My lawn had disappeared entirely, and the road out front of my place looked less like a road and more like a long, uninterrupted snowfield that happened to have mailboxes along it. I pulled the laminated notice off my door at about 6:15. I remember the exact time because I just started my second cup of coffee, and the cold air that rushed in when I cracked the door nearly knocked the mug out of my hand. The notice was printed on bright yellow paper, which Marlene always favored because she said it conveyed urgency, and it had the Crestwood Circle HOA logo stamped at the top in blue ink. I read it standing there in my socked feet in the open doorway, snow blowing sideways past my face, and I genuinely had to read it twice before I believed what it said. Notice to all residents. Effective immediately and through the current winter season, the operation of gas-powered snow blowers and all motorized snow removal equipment is prohibited before 9:00 a.m. Violations will result in a fine of $150 for the first offense and $300 for each subsequent offense. This measure has been approved by the HOA board to protect the quality of life and reasonable sleep expectations of all community members. Thank you for your cooperation. M. Dennison, HOA President. I stood there for a solid 10 seconds just staring at it. Then I looked up at the snow that was actively still falling. Then I looked at my driveway, which had about 18 inches of heavy, wet, packy snow sitting on it. Then I looked back at the notice. And I did the thing I always do when Marlene pulls something that defies basic logic, which is take a very slow, very deep breath, pour myself a third cup of coffee, and sit down at my kitchen table to think about what I was actually going to do about it. Now, let me back up and give you some context about Marlene Dennison, because she didn't just arrive at this level of absurdity overnight. Marlene had been HOA president of Crestwood Circle for going on 4 years, and in that time she had fined people for having the wrong color mulch, cited a retired schoolteacher named Harold Whitmore for planting petunias that Marlene felt were too aggressively pink, and sent a formal letter to a couple down the street demanding they remove a wind chime that she claimed disrupted the neighborhood's acoustic aesthetic, whatever that means. She was the kind of person who treated the HOA rulebook like it was a sacred text, and her own opinion like it was the amendment process. She had a way of smiling at you that never quite reached her eyes and a way of saying things like, per the governing documents, that made the phrase sound like a legal threat. But this, the snow blower ban before 9 in the morning, this was a new level even for her. Because here's the thing about Crestwood Circle. It's a cul-de-sac community with about 22 homes, all detached single-family houses, and it backs up to a highway access road. The HOA is technically responsible for the interior roads, meaning the loop road that connects all 22 houses and the shared driveways that branch off it. The city handles the main roads outside, but the interior is on us. And when you get a foot and a half of snow overnight in the middle of January, those interior roads don't clear themselves. For the past 3 winters, the way it had worked was that a handful of us with snow blowers, me included, would get up early, usually around 6 or 6:30, clear our own driveways, and then make a coordinated pass of the interior road so that people could get out. We'd always been done by 8 or 8:30, which meant people could get their kids to school and themselves to work without any drama. It was an informal but very functional system, and nobody complained about it except Marlene. And her complaint had apparently been simmering since last winter when my neighbor Dave Kowalski fired up his Husqvarna at 6:45 and Marlene, who lived 4 houses away, apparently heard it and didn't appreciate having her morning disrupted. So she'd spent the fall engineering a ban, and she dropped it on our doors the morning of the biggest snow event of the year so far, in the form of a laminated yellow notice. Classic Marlene. I sat at my kitchen table and drank my coffee and watched the snow keep falling and thought about the fact that I had to be at work by 10. I work in insurance, property insurance specifically, which has a certain irony given the situation. My office is about 12 miles away. If the interior road wasn't cleared before 9, there was a real chance I wasn't getting out at all before noon, because the city snowplow wouldn't touch our interior roads, and the HOA's contracted plowing service, a small outfit called Hendricks Plowing, had an agreement that said they'd come out after the snow stopped, not during. So even if the snow stopped falling at 8, Hendricks wouldn't be there until 10 at the earliest, and that assumed they weren't already buried with other calls. I picked up my phone and called Dave Kowalski. Dave lives next door, he's got the Husqvarna, and he's the kind of guy who has strong opinions about snow equipment. He answered on the second ring, and I could tell from his voice that he'd already read the notice. "You see this thing," he said, skipping hello entirely. "I saw it," I said. "She can't do this," he said. "There's 18 inches out there, Frank, 18 inches. I looked out at the road and you can't even tell there is a road." "I know," I said. "Let me think about this for a second." "What's there to think about? I'm going out there. If you go out before 9, she'll fine you. Then she fines me. Let her try to collect." I told him to hold off for just a little while, not because I thought Marlene's rule was reasonable or enforceable, but because I had an idea that was going to be a lot more satisfying than just ignoring the notice and paying the fine. I'd learned over 4 years of dealing with Marlene that the best way to beat her wasn't to just steamroll past her. It was to let her dig her own hole, document it thoroughly, and then show everyone what she'd done. That approach had worked before, and I had a feeling it was going to work spectacularly today. The first thing I did was sit down and type a very polite, very carefully worded email to Marlene and the 2 other board members. A guy named Phil Garvey, who mostly went along with whatever Marlene wanted, and a quieter woman named Diane Cho, who had actually tried to push back on a few of Marlene's more aggressive moves. In the email, I asked very calmly whether the board had considered the fact that the interior roads would be impassable for several hours, during which residents might have genuine emergencies, work obligations, and school drop-offs. And I asked specifically whether the HOA had arranged for alternative snow removal to be completed before 9 a.m. in light of the new restriction. I sent the email at 6:40, and I put the timestamp on my screen in the screenshot I immediately took of it, including the sent confirmation. I also walked around my house and did something I'd actually set up back in the fall after a separate dust-up with Marlene involving my holiday lights and a cease and desist letter. I had a set of 4 outdoor security cameras covering my front yard, my driveway, and a wide enough angle to catch the road out front. They were running on a cloud recording service. I checked the app to confirm all 4 were recording and capturing good footage despite the snow, and they were. I took a screenshot of that too. Then I put on my coat, my boots, my hat and gloves, grabbed a shovel, and went outside to do what I was actually allowed to do under Marlene's notice, which was shovel by hand. The notice specifically said motorized equipment. It said nothing about shovels, so I started shoveling. I also texted Dave and told him to hold the snow blower but feel free to shovel, and I texted my other neighbor on the opposite side, a retired guy named Cal Bertrand who had an old Toro that he kept in meticulous condition, and told him the same thing. Cal texted back a string of words I won't repeat here, but he came outside with his shovel. By 7:15, there were 6 of us out there with shovels, working the road by hand. It was grueling work in snow that heavy. The temperature was about 12 degrees, and the wind had picked up and my back was already starting to complain by the time I'd done my driveway. The road itself was another story. 6 guys with shovels attacking a road that was maybe 14 feet wide and several hundred feet long, covered in 1.5 feet of heavy wet snow, is not a fast process. But we were doing it. And we were documenting every minute of it on my phone's camera, because I had a very specific reason for wanting that footage. At 8:05, Marlene appeared. I saw her coming down the road from the direction of her house, bundled up in a bright blue parka with a fur-trimmed hood, which seemed excessive even for 12 degrees, and she was carrying what I can only describe as a clipboard. She had an actual clipboard in a snowstorm. I will never stop finding that funny. She walked up to where Dave and I were working and she said, very pleasantly, in that way she has where the pleasantness is completely synthetic, "Good morning, Frank. Good morning, Dave." I wanted to make sure everyone received their notice. "We got the notice, Marlene," I said, leaning on my shovel. "Wonderful," she said, making a note on her clipboard. "I see you're using shovels, which is of course perfectly acceptable. I'm glad to see the community taking the initiative." "We're taking the initiative because the road's buried and people need to get to work," Dave said. "Of course," Marlene said, still smiling. "And I'm sure with everyone pitching in, you'll have the road clear in no time." "With shovels," I said, "in 18 inches of snow." "Well," she said, and there was just the slightest edge behind the smile now, "the rule is clear." Before 9 a.m., motorized equipment disrupts the neighborhood. I received feedback from several residents that the early morning noise last winter was genuinely disruptive. "This is about quality of life for everyone." "Quality of life," Cal said from about 15 feet away, not looking up from where he was shoveling. Cal is 68 years old and has a bad knee, and he was out there shoveling in 12-degree weather at 8 in the morning because of Marlene's rule. "Quality of life," he said again and left it at that. Marlene made another note on her clipboard and walked back toward her house. I watched her go. I checked my phone. No reply to my email yet. We kept shoveling. By 8:40, we had maybe 40% of the road done, which was actually impressive given the conditions and the equipment we were working with, but it meant 60% was still buried. People had started coming out of their houses by then. A woman named Terry Holt, who has 3 kids under 10 and works as a nurse, came out at 8:30 and looked at the road with an expression that I can only describe as controlled panic. She had a 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. shift and had been counting on being able to get out. She'd already missed the first hour and a half of it. She came over and started shoveling next to me without saying anything for a few minutes, and then she said quietly, "Frank, what time is it?" 8:38, I said. 22 more minutes, she said. "I know," I said. At 9:01, with the road still about 50% uncleared, Dave started his Husqvarna. The sound of it was like a choir of angels. I will not apologize for saying that. It was the most beautiful mechanical sound I'd heard all winter. Cal fired up his Toro about 30 seconds later. 2 other neighbors who'd been waiting with their snow blowers came out. Within 15 minutes, those 4 machines had done what 6 guys with shovels hadn't managed in 2.5 hours. The road was clear. The shared driveways were clear. The turnaround at the end of the cul-de-sac was clear. People could get out. Terry Holt got in her car at 9:20, windows scraped, and gave me a wave as she headed out. She was going to be 2.5 hours late for a nursing shift because of this. I made a note of that. Dave parked his snow blower back in his garage and came over to where I was standing on the cleared road, both of us a little out of breath from the morning's work, and he said, "Okay, what do we do about this?" And I said, "We wait." Because here's the part where Marlene, being Marlene, was not capable of leaving well enough alone. The email reply came at 11:47 a.m. I was at work by then, having left the house at 9:35 after the roads were clear, and I was in the middle of reviewing a policy file when my phone buzzed. The email was from Marlene, and it was copied to Phil Garvey and Diane Cho, and also, notably, to the HOA's attorney, a woman named Patricia Vance, who mostly handled minor disputes and fee collection. The email said, in part, that it had come to the board's attention that the interior roads of Crestwood Circle had been inadequately maintained through the late morning hours of that day, creating what Marlene described as a failure of basic community responsibility. She noted that the roads had not been fully cleared until past 9 a.m., which she found unacceptable, and she wanted to know what steps would be taken to ensure this did not happen again. I read the email twice to make sure I was reading it correctly. Then I forwarded it to Dave, Cal, and about 8 other neighbors with a single line of my own. She's complaining the roads were still buried by noon. The response from the neighborhood was swift and deeply satisfying. Dave replied all within about 3 minutes with a message that said, very politely, that the roads were cleared as quickly as possible given the restriction on motorized equipment before 9 a.m., and noted that if the snow blowers had been permitted to operate at 6:30 as in previous years, the road would have been clear by 8. Cal sent an email that was shorter and considerably more pointed. Terry Holt, who was presumably between patients at the hospital, sent a 1-paragraph message explaining that she had been 2.5 hours late to her nursing shift as a direct result of the delayed road clearing and asking whether the board intended to address this. And Diane Cho, the quieter board member, sent an email to the whole thread that simply said, "I think we need to reconsider the timing restriction." Marlene's response to all of this was to double down, which was absolutely on brand. She sent back a message saying that the noise complaints from last winter were well documented, and that the board's decision had been made in the best interests of the community. She also noted, somewhat pointedly, that residents with concerns about the timing of snow removal were welcome to attend the next board meeting to raise their grievances through the proper channels. That's when I pulled out the thing I'd been sitting on since that morning. Back in the fall, when I was doing my research after the holiday lights incident, I'd spent a genuinely educational couple of hours reading through the HOA's governing documents. Not just skimming them, actually reading them, the declaration, the bylaws, and the rules and regulations. And buried in the declaration, in a section that I'm guessing Marlene had never read carefully because it wasn't convenient for her, was a clause that specifically addressed the HOA's obligations regarding access and safety. The relevant language said that the HOA was required to take reasonable and timely steps to maintain the interior roads and shared access points in a condition that allowed safe passage for residents, and that this obligation could not be waived or subordinated to other rules in a way that created a genuine safety hazard. There was also a separate clause that dealt with modifications to the rules and regulations, which was where Marlene's notice had been issued under. That clause said that changes to the rules and regulations required approval by a majority of the board at a properly noticed meeting, meaning that residents had to be informed about the meeting in advance and had to be given the opportunity to comment. It also said that any rule change had to be consistent with the declaration and bylaws and couldn't conflict with them. Marlene had slipped the notice under our doors at about 6 in the morning on the day of the snowstorm. There had been no meeting notice to residents. There had been no opportunity for comment. And the rule conflicted directly with the HOA's obligation to maintain the roads safely, which was established in the declaration, which ranked above the rules and regulations in the governing hierarchy. She had essentially enacted an illegal rule change that directly undermined the HOA's own safety obligations, with no proper notice, no meeting, no vote that complied with the bylaws, and no alternative plan for clearing the roads. And then she complained that the roads weren't clear. I typed my response to the email thread that evening. I was not rude. I was not sarcastic. I was extremely specific. I cited the exact sections of the declaration and bylaws, quoted the relevant language, and explained clearly why the snow blower restriction as implemented was procedurally invalid and substantively contrary to the HOA's own governing documents. I noted the timestamps on my morning email asking about alternative snow removal arrangements, which had gone unanswered for over 5 hours. I noted that Terry Holt had been delayed for her nursing shift. I attached photographs and video clips from my security cameras showing the state of the road at 6 a.m., 7 a.m., and 8 a.m., and contrasted that with the cleared road at 9:15 after the snow blowers were permitted to operate. I stated clearly that I was requesting a properly noticed board meeting to address the restriction, and I noted that until such a meeting took place, and any rule change was properly adopted in compliance with the bylaws, the restriction had no valid standing. I copied the same 8 neighbors on it. I also, after a moment of consideration, sent a separate copy to Patricia Vance, the HOA attorney, directly, because I figured she'd want to know what she'd gotten herself copied onto. I hit send and went to bed. The next 2 days were honestly some of the most entertaining of my entire tenure at Crestwood Circle, and I say that as someone who once watched Marlene argue for 45 minutes at a board meeting about the acceptable variance in lawn height measurements. Phil Garvey, who, as I mentioned, usually just went along with Marlene, sent me a private email the next morning that said he hadn't been aware of the procedural issues I'd raised, and that he was going to want to look into this more carefully before the next board meeting. That was the first crack. Phil was not a bad guy. He was just lazy about governance and tended to let Marlene run things because it was easier than fighting her. But Phil was also a retired civil engineer and had a fairly precise mind when he chose to use it, and I got the sense that my email had made him genuinely uncomfortable. Patricia Vance, the attorney, called Marlene that same morning. I didn't know this at the time but found out later. Apparently the call was not a warm one. Patricia had read the governing documents I'd cited and had reached essentially the same conclusions I had, which was that the rule change as implemented was procedurally defective and could not be enforced. She'd also flagged the safety obligation issue, which apparently made Marlene very upset because Marlene had been counting on Patricia to back her up, and Patricia was not in a position to do that in good conscience. Meanwhile, on the ground at Crestwood Circle, the neighborhood had been galvanized in a way I hadn't seen since the Petunias incident, and honestly that hadn't galvanized them this thoroughly. People were talking. People who normally just paid their dues and stayed out of HOA drama were knocking on doors and having actual conversations. Terry Holt had told her story to pretty much everyone on the street, and the image of a nurse being 2.5 hours late to her shift because of a snow blower ban had a way of focusing people's minds. Harold Whitmore, the retired teacher with the Petunias, had already sent Marlene a letter by certified mail requesting a copy of the meeting minutes that approved the snow blower restriction, knowing full well there were no such minutes because there had been no meeting. 2 days after the snowstorm, Marlene called an emergency board meeting. She sent a notice out via the HOA's email list, and the notice said the meeting was about winter property maintenance protocols, which was the blandest possible way to describe what was clearly a damage control session. The meeting was to be held at her house, in her living room, which was typical because she liked controlling the venue. About 14 residents showed up. That's roughly 60% of the homes on Crestwood Circle, which is extraordinary for an HOA meeting in January. Marlene's living room, which was decorated with a lot of beige and what I can only describe as aggressively tasteful throw pillows, was not designed to hold 14 people and a folding table, but we made it work. Marlene opened the meeting with a prepared statement about how the board had always acted in the best interests of the community, and how she personally had received multiple complaints about early morning snow blower noise from unnamed residents. She said the restriction had been intended to balance the needs of all residents and that she was open to discussing refinements to the policy. I let her finish. Then I raised my hand, and she looked at me the way she always does when I raise my hand, which is the look of someone who has stepped on something unpleasant. "Marlene," I said, I appreciate you calling this meeting. I do want to put the procedural question on the table first before we get into substance, because I think it's important. Can you point me to the meeting minutes where this rule change was approved? She said that the board had made the decision in consultation with each other, which was her way of saying the three of them had texted about it or had a phone call. I asked whether that consultation had been a properly noticed meeting as required by Article 7 of the bylaws, which required a minimum of 5 days' notice to the full membership for any meeting at which rule changes would be voted upon. She said that emergency situations sometimes required expedited action. I said that I was happy to hear what the emergency was that required a rule restricting snow blower use to be implemented without proper notice in advance of a major snowstorm, because from where I was standing it looked like the rule had been prepared in advance and laminated, which wasn't consistent with an emergency response. There was a sound in the room that I can only describe as 14 people trying very hard not to laugh simultaneously. Phil Garvey was looking at the carpet with tremendous focus. Diane Cho was looking at me with an expression that I think was gratitude. Marlene's jaw tightened. She said she would take my concerns under advisement. I said respectfully that I wasn't raising concerns. I was raising a procedural objection, and that per the governing documents an invalidly enacted rule could not be enforced, and any fines issued under such a rule would be subject to challenge. Harold Whitmore, sitting in the corner, said quietly, "Hear, hear." Marlene tried to steer the meeting toward a discussion of the noise complaints, naming no specific complainants, but implying that there were many. I asked her to provide the written documentation of the complaints she'd referenced, since the HOA rulebook required that complaints be submitted in writing to be considered by the board. She said she would need to compile those records. I said that was fine, and that I'd like to receive them within 10 days as the governing documents allowed for records requests. Dave leaned over to me during this exchange and whispered, "Did you actually memorize the whole governing document?" I whispered back, "Just the parts she ignores." The meeting lasted another hour and a half, and by the end of it 3 things had happened. First, Phil Garvey moved to formally table the snow blower restriction pending a proper review and a duly noticed board meeting. Diane Cho seconded it. Even Marlene, facing the math of the situation, voted for it, probably because voting against it at that point would have been spectacular even by her standards. Second, a motion was passed, again by the full board, to issue a written apology to residents for the disruption caused that morning, to be drafted by Phil and Diane rather than Marlene after some gentle negotiation. Third, and this was the part I hadn't fully anticipated but was very pleased about, a motion was passed to form a winter maintenance committee made up of residents, which would be empowered to coordinate snow removal on the interior roads with proper community input and a budget allocation. I was asked to chair that committee. I said I'd be happy to. Marlene said that she looked forward to working with the committee in a collaborative spirit. The way she said it could have curdled milk. The written apology went out about a week later. It was polite and somewhat non-committal, but it went out. I kept a copy. Now here's where the story takes a turn I genuinely didn't see coming, and I'm not proud to say that for a few weeks after the meeting I thought we were done. I thought Marlene had been checked, the bad rule had been tabled, the winter maintenance committee was getting organized, and life at Crestwood Circle was going to settle back into its usual low-grade dysfunction. I thought wrong, because Marlene wasn't done. She couldn't find the neighbors for using snow blowers anymore, since the restriction had been tabled. She couldn't override the new committee because it had been formally created by a board vote. But she had one more play left, and she ran it in the most Marlene way possible, which is to say with a clipboard and a selective interpretation of paperwork. About 3 weeks after the meeting, I started getting calls from 3 of my neighbors on the committee. All 3 of them had received certified letters from the HOA saying they were in arrears on their dues. 2 of them were certain they'd paid, and one, An older gentleman named Ray Finch, who was a bit scattered with paperwork, wasn't sure. The arrears amounts were suspiciously precise, not round numbers, and all 3 letters had been sent on the same date, which was 2 days after the Winter Maintenance Committee had met for the first time and made some decisions about the snow removal budget that Marlene hadn't liked. The 2 were certain they'd paid pulled their bank records. Both of them had cleared payments documented, one paid by check with a bank-cleared stamp, and one paid by automatic transfer with a transaction ID. They'd both paid on time. The HOA's records, or at least the records Marlene was presenting through her letters, showed no payment received. Ray Finch found his records too, after some digging. He'd paid by money order, which he did every year, and he had the receipt. What had happened to those payments? That was the question. And it was a question that got considerably more interesting when Dave, who had a background in bookkeeping from his previous job, started asking Marlene for the HOA's financial records as part of what the bylaws allowed any resident to request. The HOA's records were supposed to be maintained by the HOA treasurer, which was Phil Garvey. Phil, when asked, said he'd submitted all financial records to Marlene for centralized filing at the start of his term because it was more efficient. Marlene, of course, controlled all the filing. Dave filed a formal written request for financial records under the governing documents and the applicable state law, which gave the HOA 15 days to respond. Marlene acknowledged the request and said the records were being organized for review. 15 days passed. No records. Dave sent a follow-up, copying Patricia Vance and citing the state statute that required HOA financial records to be made available to members within the specified time frame. Patricia Vance, who was now very clearly not enjoying her association with this situation, forwarded it to Marlene with a note that said, essentially, that the HOA needed to comply. Marlene produced some records. They were incomplete, disorganized, and covered only part of the fiscal year. When Dave sat down with Phil Garvey and they went through what was available, they found something that neither of them had expected. There were gaps. Not small gaps, not bookkeeping error gaps, but actual missing entries covering several months of dues collection. The amounts that 3 neighbors had been told they owed corresponded, suspiciously closely, to dues payments that appeared in the records as collected but not deposited into the HOA account. Phil Garvey, to his very significant credit, went pale when Dave showed him this. Phil called Patricia Vance that same afternoon. Patricia Vance told him she had an obligation to advise the board that if this was what it appeared to be, it was not a matter for the HOA to handle internally. To be completely clear, what it appeared to be was that HOA dues payments were being received and not deposited, which is, in the most basic terms, misappropriation of funds, which is, to be more specific about it, theft. I want to be careful here because I'm a regular person, not an accountant or a lawyer, and I'm telling you what unfolded as I understood it. But when Phil and Dave brought their documentation to Patricia Vance, and she reviewed it, her assessment was clear enough that she told them she couldn't continue to represent the HOA in good conscience without the board addressing it, and that if it wasn't addressed, she would need to advise Phil and Diane in their individual capacities that they had potential personal liability for failure to act. Phil Garvey called the police. He did it himself, voluntarily, without Marlene's knowledge. He called the non-emergency line, explained the situation, and a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit made an appointment to come review the documentation. The detective, a calm and methodical woman named Riley, came to Phil's house on a Thursday afternoon. Dave was there. I was there at Phil's invitation, primarily because I had the security camera footage from the morning of the snowstorm on a flash drive that Phil had asked me to bring. Not because the snow footage was directly relevant to the financial question, but because Phil said he wanted the detective to understand the full context of what had been happening in the community and who was at the center of it. Detective Riley sat at Phil's kitchen table for about 2 hours, going through the documents Dave had organized, asking precise, unhurried questions. She looked at the bank statements. She looked at the dues records. She looked at the money order receipt from Ray Finch, which was particularly useful because money orders have serial numbers and can be tracked. She was quiet and professional and didn't tip her hand about what conclusions she was drawing, but she asked for copies of everything. She also, at the end of the meeting, asked whether Marlene had sole control of the HOA's bank account. Phil confirmed that she did, that the account was in the HOA's name, but that Marlene was the only signatory. Phil said, looking genuinely sick about it, that he had agreed to that arrangement when he took over as treasurer because Marlene had said it was simpler and he hadn't questioned it. Detective Riley made a note and said she'd be in touch. Marlene was notified of the investigation about a week later, through the legal process rather than through Phil or anyone in the neighborhood. I don't know exactly how that notification worked, but I know that within 24 hours of whatever it was, Patricia Vance formally withdrew from representing the HOA, and Marlene showed up at Phil's door trying to, from what Phil told me later, explain that there had been a bookkeeping misunderstanding. Phil told her, politely but firmly, that he'd referred the matter to law enforcement and that anything she wanted to say about it should be said to them. The investigation took about 6 weeks from that first meeting with Detective Riley. During that time, life at Crestwood Circle was extremely tense in a way that was different from the usual Marlene-related tension. There were no more laminated yellow notices. There were no more clipboard appearances at 6 in the morning. Marlene mostly stayed inside her house, and when she did appear outside, she was noticeably subdued in a way that was so contrary to her usual manner that it was almost disconcerting. Like one of those nature documentaries where the predator is suddenly very still right before something significant happens. The Winter Maintenance Committee, which I was chairing, kept meeting. We established a formal protocol for snow removal that included a pre-dawn start time for large accumulation events, coordination between the 4 residents with snow blowers, and a backup plan using Hendrix plowing for the rare situations when volunteer capacity wasn't enough. We submitted the protocol to Phil and Diane for board approval. They approved it at a properly noticed meeting with full resident input, and it became official HOA policy. Nobody made any noise about noise complaints. Partly because the formal complaints Marlene had referenced never materialized, the record she was supposed to produce within 10 days had never come, and partly because when the whole neighborhood understood what the actual stakes of good snow removal were, the abstract annoyance of an early morning engine was a lot easier to put in perspective. The second big snow event of the winter came in February, about 6 weeks after the January storm. It was a smaller event, 8 inches, and the morning went exactly as it should have. Dave was out at 6:30 with his Husqvarna. Cal had his Toro going by 6:45. 2 other neighbors contributed. The road was clear by 7:50. Terry Holt left her house at 7:35 and got to her shift on time. I drove out at 8:15 with no drama whatsoever. It was one of those mornings that's almost worth the winter, cold and crisp and clear, fresh snow piled neatly along the edges of a clean road, everyone going about their day without friction. I stopped at the end of the cul-de-sac and looked back at the road for a moment before turning onto the city street, and I remember thinking that this was what the neighborhood was supposed to feel like when nobody was making things harder than they needed to be. The legal outcome came in March. I'm going to be honest with you. I didn't know all the details the day they happened, because I wasn't there for any of it, but Phil called me that evening and told me what he knew. Marlene had been formally charged with misappropriation of funds and breach of fiduciary duty in connection with her role as HOA president. The specific allegation was that over a period of approximately 2 years, Dues payments totaling somewhere in the range of $6,000 had been received by the HOA but not deposited into the HOA account. The investigation had traced several of those payments, including Ray Finch's money order, to a personal account in Marlene's name. Phil's voice on the phone was quiet and a little shell-shocked. He said, "I should have been paying more attention, Frank. I should have been doing my job." I said, "Phil, she specifically set it up so you couldn't pay attention. That's different from you failing." He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Maybe, but I'm going to do better from here." Marlene was arraigned, posted bail, and immediately resigned from the HOA board. The resignation letter was a single sentence and contained no acknowledgement of wrongdoing and no apology, which surprised exactly nobody. Phil stepped up as interim president while the community figured out what came next, and Diane Cho took on a more active role in a way that I think she'd been wanting to do for a long time, but hadn't quite had the opening for. The case eventually resulted in a plea arrangement that required Marlene to make full restitution of the misappropriated funds plus interest, complete a period of community service, and serve a term of probation. She did not go to prison, which some of the neighbors felt strongly about and others were more neutral on. My own view is that the restitution and the probation and the public record of what happened were more important than the specific sentence, because the money went back to where it belonged, and there was now a matter of documented public record establishing what she had done. She was also, obviously, permanently barred from serving on the HOA board, which was specified in the settlement terms. The neighborhood itself went through a kind of collective reckoning in the aftermath of all this, and it was actually one of the more interesting things I've witnessed in my years at Crestwood Circle. People started paying attention to HOA governance in a way they hadn't before. The meeting in Marlene's living room in January had been the start of it, but it went further once the full financial picture came out. There were conversations on the street and in driveways and over fences that I don't think had ever happened before, not because people hadn't been neighborly, but because the HOA had always been this background thing that most people just tolerated rather than engaged with. We held a formal election for 2 open board seats that spring, properly noticed, open nominations, the whole thing. Dave ran and won. Terry Holt, the nurse, ran and won. Phil stayed on as president for the remainder of his term with a mandate to actually do the job, which he did, keeping meticulous financial records that were shared with residents quarterly on the HOA website that Dave set up. Because it turned out Dave also had web design skills he'd never had a reason to deploy for the community before. The HOA's bank account was restructured to require 2 signatories for any transaction over $500. The financial records were shifted to a third-party property management software, so there was an independent audit trail. None of these were dramatic changes. They were just the kind of basic governance infrastructure that should have been in place all along, and hadn't been, because one person had been systematically keeping them out of place. Summer came to Crestwood Circle after that, and it was the most pleasant summer I could remember since moving in. Not because everything was perfect, because it never is, but because the background hum of low-grade manipulation that Marlene had been running for 4 years was just gone. The HOA still had opinions about things like fence heights and driveway cracks, and there were still occasional disagreements between neighbors about things like property lines and guest parking, but they got handled through actual conversation and actual process instead of laminated yellow notices and midnight certified letters. Harold Whitmore planted petunias again that June. Big, aggressively pink ones, right along his front walkway. Dave, in his capacity as a board member, reviewed the situation thoroughly and issued a formal determination that the petunias were fine. Harold thanked him by dropping off a tin of cookies at Dave's door, which I think is exactly the right use of HOA energy. I kept the winter maintenance committee going through the summer, meeting a couple of times to refine the protocol for the upcoming cold season and make sure we had the right equipment and the right volunteers. Hendricks Plowing came in and renegotiated our contract with us, now dealing with a committee that actually had a clear understanding of what was needed instead of a single person making all the decisions unilaterally. We got a better rate and a better response time commitment out of the new contract, which meant the community was getting more value for the same dues. By the time October rolled around and the first frost warnings started showing up in the weather app, I felt genuinely ready for winter in a way I hadn't felt in years at this house. Not just ready in the practical sense, though we were that too, but ready in the sense of having a community that was pointed in the right direction. People knew each other better. People trusted the process because the process actually worked. If it snowed at 2 in the morning, the snow blowers would be running at first light, and the road would be clear before anyone needed to be anywhere, because that's what we'd agreed to, and that's what the governing documents actually supported. I thought about that a lot as October became November and November got colder. I thought about that yellow laminated notice, about standing in my doorway at 6:15 in 12-degree weather reading it. I thought about Cal out there in the snow with his bad knee and his shovel because a gas-powered engine was too noisy for Marlene's morning. I thought about Terry Holt pulling out of her driveway 2.5 hours late for her nursing shift. And I thought about the email Marlene had sent at 11:47 in the morning complaining that the roads were still buried, as though she'd had nothing to do with why. That kind of breathtaking audacity, the audacity of creating a problem and then loudly complaining about the consequences of the problem you created, is something I've thought about a lot in the context of HOA governance specifically, because it's not unique to Marlene. It's a pattern that happens when one person gets enough control over a small system that they stop experiencing the consequences of their own decisions. Marlene had exempted herself from the logic of the situation. She lived on the other end of the cul-de-sac, far enough from Dave's house that the Husqvarna woke her up, but close enough to the main road that she probably had an easier time getting out. She designed the rule to solve her problem, and she hadn't had to sit in her driveway unable to get to work. She'd complained about the roads being buried from a position where she wasn't particularly affected by them being buried. That gap between decision-making authority and consequences is exactly what makes HOA governance go wrong, and exactly what the new structure was designed to close. The first snow of the following winter came in late November, a modest 4 inches on a Tuesday night. I was up early anyway, habit at this point, and I looked out the window at the white street and the neighbors' rooftops, and felt the quiet specific satisfaction of knowing that in about an hour Dave and Cal and the others would be out there, and the road would be clear, and nobody was going to send a laminated notice or appear with a clipboard or send a passive-aggressive email at noon. The snow blowers started at 6:22. I checked the timestamp on my phone just because I could. I stood at my kitchen window with my coffee and watched the road get cleared, clean passes back and forth, snow sailing off to the side in clean arcs, and by the time my second cup was ready the road was done. I sent a text to the Winter Maintenance Committee chat. "Good work, everyone." Dave sent back a thumbs up. Cal sent back a coffee mug emoji, which I interpreted as an endorsement of my current activity. Terry, who was presumably heading to her shift shortly, sent back a small heart, which is about as effusive as Terry gets over text, but which I knew was genuine. I got dressed, scraped my car, backed out of my clean driveway, and drove out of Crestwood Circle on a clean road into a clean winter morning, and that was that. That was how it was supposed to go. No drama, no laminated notices, no complaints about noise at 6 a.m. from someone who had already made it impossible to fix the problem the noise was solving. Just a neighborhood taking care of itself, the way a neighborhood is supposed to. There's a last thing I want to tell you about, because it happened at the spring HOA meeting the following year. The one where the new board officially presented the year-end financial report and the updated governing documents, and the Winter Maintenance Committee's recommendations for codifying the snow removal protocol into the rules and regulations through a proper vote. It was a well-attended meeting, held in the community room of the local library because we'd outgrown Marlene's living room as a venue, and the library let us use the space for free. At the end of the meeting, during the open forum section where any resident can say whatever they want for 2 minutes, Harold Whitmore stood up. Harold is a small man with white hair and an extremely measured way of speaking that comes from 30 years of explaining things to 10-year-olds. He said that he wanted to take a moment to acknowledge what the community had been through in the past year and what it had come out with. He said that Crestwood Circle had been under a kind of governance for several years that most of them had put up with because it seemed easier than challenging it, and that the events of the previous January had shown that challenging it was not only possible but necessary and ultimately, he said, not as hard as it had seemed. He said he wanted to thank the people who had done the work of challenging it, and he named Dave and Cal and Terry and Phil and Diane and me by name, and there was genuine applause in the library community room, which I found unexpectedly moving. He also said, and this is the part I keep coming back to, that the lesson he took from the whole episode was not that HOAs are bad or that governance is bad, but that governance without accountability is dangerous, and that the best protection against it is residents who actually pay attention, actually show up, and actually read the documents. He said, with the timing of a man who had spent a career teaching, the rule book only works for you if you know what it says. I thought about that yellow laminated notice, about standing in the doorway at 6:15 reading it and reading it again, about going inside to get my coffee and sitting down to think instead of just reacting, about pulling the governing documents up on my laptop and reading through them until I found what I needed, and finding not just the procedural flaw in Marlene's notice, but the deeper obligation the HOA owed to its own residents, the obligation she'd been treating as optional. I thought about how it had started with a snow blower ban and ended with a criminal referral, and how those two things were connected not by coincidence, but by the same pattern, the same person. The same habit of treating authority as a personal tool rather than a community trust. The snow blower ban was just the moment it came into sharp enough focus that enough people could see it clearly. After the meeting, Cal came up to me in the parking lot, moving carefully on the spring ice that was still in the shaded corners of the lot. He had his coat on and his keys in his hand, and he looked at me with the expression of a man who has shoveled a very long road by hand and survived it and has thoughts. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said. "Tell me," I said. "I keep thinking about her standing there in that parka with the clipboard," he said, "at 8 in the morning, in the snowstorm. Writing things down, while we're out there killing ourselves with shovels." I said, "I know. The clipboard," he said. "That really gets me. Who brings a clipboard to a snowstorm?" I laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that comes from the gut, and Cal laughed too, and a couple of other neighbors who'd overheard us started laughing. And for a moment in that cold spring parking lot outside the library, with the last of the winter ice still in the corners and the early April sky turning colors above us, it was just funny. It was genuinely, thoroughly funny. The clipboard, the parka, the laminated yellow notice. The email at 11:47 complaining that the roads were still buried. And underneath the funny, underneath all of it, was the solid, satisfying feeling of a thing that had been wrong getting made right. Not perfectly right, not magically right, but right in the way that actual work and actual accountability makes things right, which is to say durably, verifiably, with paperwork. I drove home to Crestwood Circle through a town that was still dirty with the tail end of winter, salt lines on the roads and gray snow piled at the corners of parking lots. But my own street was clean, and the faces I saw in the windows and driveways as I pulled into my place were familiar and, I thought, a little less guarded than they'd been a year ago. That's not nothing. In a neighborhood, in a small community where you live next to the same people for years. That's actually quite a lot. I parked in my clean driveway, turned off the engine, and sat for a second listening to the engine tick as it cooled. My security cameras watched the quiet street from their mounts. The road was clear and dry, and showed no signs of ever having been buried under 1.5 feet of January snow, while a woman in a fur-trimmed parka wrote things on a clipboard. Crestwood Circle, I thought, was going to be okay. I went inside, put on the coffee, and looked up what the forecast was for the rest of the week. Partly cloudy, above freezing, no precipitation in sight. Marlene would have hated it. I poured my coffee and raised the mug very slightly at the window, at the clean road and the bare trees and the quiet cul-de-sac that we had, despite everything, managed to hold onto. "Cheers," I said to nobody in particular. And that was enough.